back. Today I will be reading some of my old history papers from junior year of high school. And I'm going to be starting with the oldest one, and then I'm just going to, progress along. And, yeah. Alrighty. Some of them have names. I guess I'll include the names. Okay. Alrighty, and let's get started. Trace back the story. What is most amazing and refreshing is that the past usually speaks for itself. What do Louisiana Cajuns, the city of Pittsburgh, and the taxation of Britain's 13 colonies all have in common? All of them can be traced directly back to the French and Indian War, a conflict that took place in North America during the mid-1700s. This war may seem relatively insignificant, as it's not often discussed anymore, but its impact on the world today is, in truth, undeniable. In the first body paragraph of my paper, I will cover the why behind the conflict, how it started, and for what reasons. The second paragraph will look into the role George Washington, the first president of the United States of America, played in the war. The third and final paragraph will include a general overview of the war, including important battles, politics, and the like. I will also briefly cover the impact that the war had on American history. You may be familiar with the name of the French and Indian War, but you might not be as informed on the reason why the conflict occurred. What led to this war? What were some of the contributing factors? By the year 1754, several European countries had claimed land in the New World. But the most sprawling territories were straddled by France, Spain, and Britain. Several wars, some stemming from local politics, others from European disputes, had been fought on the fertile soil of South and particularly North America. In this paper, I will focus specifically on how these three wars, the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739 to 1742, the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, contributed to the French and Indian War. The first of these wars I mentioned is the perfect example. It is described by one of my sources here. It was precipitated by an incident that took place in 1738 when Captain Robert Jenkins appeared before a committee of the House of Commons and exhibited what he alleged to be his own amputated ear, cut off in April 1731 in the West Indies by Spanish coast guards who had boarded his ship, pillaged it, and then set it adrift. Public opinion had already been aroused by other Spanish outrages on British ships, and the Jenkins episode was swiftly exploited by members of Parliament. The loss of Jenkins' ear didn't start the war, it simply provided a reason to use force. Britain and Spain and most other European countries were at that point likely to go to war over just about anything. This disposition of always expecting war and conflict was heavily influenced by the natural expansionist attitude of these countries. I would put it like this. If you weren't on the offensive, you risked being on the defensive and losing everything. It wasn't just worth the risk to sit and wait to be felled by a foe you could have deterred by displaying your weapon. This presupposition that neighbors could and would turn into enemies led the European countries to fight constant wars with each other, all of which seemed to run together. The second two wars I mentioned, the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, serve as perfect examples of different wars that sat unresolved and surfaced later under different names. When the King of Austria died and his daughter took the throne, several sovereignties, particularly Prussia, made grabs for Austrian territory, seeing that the country was weakened and in disarray. This became the First War I mentioned. These events gave birth to the 7 Years' War in 1756, where Austria took its revenge on Prussia. The alliance of Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and Spain found themselves at war with the alliance of Prussia, Britain, and Hanover. Not only was the dominance of the continent hanging in the balance, but so were each country's colonies. In 1754, shortly before war broke out in Europe, the French sent an expedition south from Canada to secure the Edenic Ohio River Valley for France by constructing several forts in the region, the greatest of which was Fort Duquesne. France's push to expand its colonial holdings in North America had succeeded. However, their movements placed their territories right outside the British frontier. The French and British were now at a dangerously close distance to one another, considering their bad blood. However, hopefully you are now more aware of the factors behind the French and Indian War. No conflict appears out of the blue. There is always a reason buried somewhere. It is likely that you know of George Washington only in the context of his presidency of the United States of America, or maybe you know slightly more and can recall the names. There's a typo there, of his daring Revolutionary War battles. The part he played in the French and Indian War is not nearly as often discussed. How significant were his exploits? Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie was one of the first to realize the threat posed to Britain by the French presence in the Ohio River Valley. The strategic positions of their forts in the wilderness had brought the shadow of French rule to British North America. Upon sending word to Britain about the situation, the governor received orders: tell the French to leave. His actions were stated by this source as follows. Dinwiddie dispatched an expedition against Fort Duquesne in western Pennsylvania. At the head of the militia was a young patrician landowner and surveyor, George Washington. The French were unshaken by the colonists' threats and requests and stayed on in the valley to the dismay of Virginia governor, who ordered the militia to set up a fort to oppose the French. Washington had his 100 men build a crude palisade in the wilderness. It was named Fort Necessity. From there, in the year 1754, Washington made one of the first actions of the war. His militia began a skirmish with a French force under Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville that had issued from Duquesne. Washington ambushed Jumonville, not far from Great Meadows. These were the first shots fired during the French and Indian War, and would have global ramifications. The skirmish left Jumonville and 9 of his men dead, as well as 21 others wounded. A survivor made his way back to Fort Duquesne and reported to his superiors what had happened. Inconveniently enough, the single surviving soldier's witness spurred the French to retaliation. They forced Washington and those in Fort Necessity to surrender, but the colonists had already besieged Britain for reinforcements, ensuring that the conflict not only continued, but spread. Although George Washington had ended the war in a powerless state, he was allowed to return to Virginia. There he wrote these sentiments about his soldiering days. Heard the bullets whistle, and there was something charming in the sound. George Washington may have failed, but he learned frontier military stratagem, something that would benefit him in his later battles against the British in the Revolutionary War. His exploits may have been insignificant, but the fact that he chose to accept and learn from his failures made him legendary. All right. The French and Indian War had begun. The volunteer militias of the 13 British colonies would have to battle alongside British regulars, well-trained government soldiers, for the freedom of the colonies from the enemy. Britain and France couldn't share dominion of North America. By the end of the war, only one would remain. Upon the arrival of British forces the following year, General Edward Braddock led an attack on Fort Duquesne with 2,500 men. While on the march through the hostile wilderness, the troops proceeded to march forward in a line, waving banners and beating drums. The French were more tactical. This wasn't Europe, nor did they fight like it was. They had been taught by their allies how to surprise the enemy while battling in the wilderness by hiding in the environment, notably in and behind trees. The Indians of this war were a group of Native Americans composed from several tribes: the Mohawks, the Senecas, the Cayugas, the Onondagas, and the Oneidas, and the Tuscaroras. Together, they formed what was called the Iroquois Confederacy. Although they had publicly claimed their neutrality in this European conflict, the group clandestinely supported and aided both the French and British sides on different occasions. One of the Iroquois' strategies, as I mentioned before, was to blend into the environment, a strategy the French army, the British regulars, and the colonial British militia were taught by sympathetic Iroquois. However, the British regulars were the least receptive of the idea. Their pride in the European strategy of open warfare was on more than one occasion, both in the French and Indian War and in the Revolutionary War, their undoing. Including Braddock's mission to Fort Duquesne. He and his 2,500 men were ambushed along the way by a French and Iroquois force which emerged from within and behind the surrounding trees. Braddock ordered his men to stand and fight the unseen enemy, which had the tactical advantage, and refused to allow the defenseless men to cover themselves in the environment around them, which was practically begging to shield them. 1,000 British regulars were slaughtered that day, Braddock among them. It was one of the most disastrous defeats in British military history. After such a crushing defeat, the British needed a victory. What they lacked in frontier warfare, they made up for in an intimidating, efficient navy. By 1756, the French and Indian War became absorbed into and a theater of the 7 Years' War in Europe, allowing for the devotion of more British imperial resources to the war in North America, including the British fleet. In 1759, the British bested the French in the naval battle of Quiberon Bay off the coast of France, thereby securing dominance over the world's oceans for 3 centuries to come. Fresh from this victory, and with a renewed sense of authority, Britain besieged the French Quebec City in Canada. General James Wolfe, the man in charge of the campaign, had been ordered to deliver France the knockout punch. By capturing the city, then under the protection of the French commander Marquis de Montcalm, after 2 months of bombarding Quebec, after 2 months of bombarding Quebec and destroying outlying settlements, Wolfe ordered 4,500 troops up an unguarded path to the Plains of Abraham and to Montreal. On September 12, 1759, there, Wolfe controlled the supply routes to Quebec, and his presence constituted a threat to the entire French colony. Had Montcalm waited inside the city's walls, he might have been relieved, but he lacked confidence in the French navy, for good reason, and embarked on a hurried, ill-conceived attack outside the fort. In the ensuing 15-minute battle, Montcalm was wounded. He died a day later, and Wolfe killed. By the end of September 13th, however, the British held the field, and 4 days later they marched into Quebec. A year later, Montreal itself fell. The French and Indian War officially ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. The British gained a substantial amount of territory. After the treaty was signed, the French turned over every one of its existing colonies in North America to Britain, except for the Louisiana Territory, given to Spain earlier in the war. It would later be returned to France in 1802. A number of Acadians, people from the French territory of Acadia, taken in 1755 by Britain, ventured south and became what are now known as Louisiana Cajuns, Acadians in a slurred southern accent. By the end of the conflict, Britain had control over all of North America, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. A number of settlers began to move west into the Ohio River Valley, and they established a fort named after William Pitt, the British Secretary of State from 1756 to 1761. It sat on the joining point of 3 rivers and would later become known as Pittsburgh. Britain's new territories required a lot of money to run efficiently, money the empire didn't have. The 7 Years' War hadn't only drained Britain's pockets, but also the pockets of other European nations. Someone had to pay the maintenance of the colonies. Why not the colonies themselves? Only the most myopic observer would argue that the Americans had not benefited greatly from Britain's sacrifice in the colonial wars, and now thought the royal ministers, the Americans ought to pay their share of the cost of Britain's and their own glory. This thought process led to the outrage of taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, and the Revolutionary War. The French and Indian War consisted of many battles, all of which are now over, but the dust they stirred, the dust that the whole world stirred, proves that it must have been of some significance. The purpose of this paper is to inform you on the French and Indian War that took place in North America in the mid-1700s. Over the course of this paper, I have covered first the why behind the war. I explained second the role America's first president, George Washington, had in the conflict. And finally, I gave a brief overview of some of the campaigns and struggles and the impact of the war on history. My exordium for this paper was and is as follows. What is most amazing and refreshing is that the past usually speaks for itself. The remarks of this source can and should be taken to mean that history tells a story, and that if you look at what is and trace it back to what was, you will be astonished at what you might find as a result. All right, and that is the paper. I do have 2 notes, I guess, that I have here at the end, and I guess it says the purpose of, I guess it's talking about Montcalm at this point, when I mentioned him earlier. But it says the purpose of the French force is disputed, with some claiming that they were scouting on British positions, and others expressing beliefs that they were a diplomatic party on a peaceful mission. And then my second note here, this is about some of the Iroquois that fought for the British. One such notable figure was named Thayendanegea, 1742 to 1807. He later took the name Joseph Brant. He was a Mohawk tribesman who went on to receive a British education in 1775 and became a captain in the British Armed Forces. And yeah. All right, and that is the paper here. And thanks for listening.